Hello, I'm Mike Buchanan, leader of the political party Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. I'm also the conference director. I'm joined as co-host today and tomorrow by someone I admire hugely, Terry White, who's doing some fantastic work on his own account and also with colleagues in Gender Parity UK. I'm really excited about this interview. Our interview in this session is someone who is, without doubt, a hero to the men's rights movement, and especially here in the UK. He's a former Eton teacher. Will Knowland, a very warm welcome, and perhaps you'd just like to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Mike. Pleasure to be here. I think most people know the broad outline, but essentially I was sacked for Eton because the content of a lecture was deemed gross misconduct. And the reason for that was that it offended a member of staff. Now, even if I had immediately taken the video down, which is what the press sometimes accuse me of getting sacked for, leaving the video up, even if I'd taken it down, it was still gross misconduct just to have put the ideas out there. Now, what were these ideas? They were essentially pretty bog standard men's rights activists, ideas about why the radical feminist view of men and society is questionable. I didn't think there was anything particularly shocking in them, but evidently there was to some people at Eton. And that's why I'm here. I didn't go into education to bite my tongue or to avoid talking about topics I think are really important. I don't think the government wants teachers to do that either. That's why curriculum content is exempt under law. So that's what my case is really about. Can we have open discussion of controversial topics? Do I need to read these questions out?
No. I'll read the first one out, and then Terry and I will alternate.
Right.
Getting a pleasing number of questions coming in. Thank you, everyone, for that. Ken Jolivet, author of the Brilliant Bob series of books. He says, "Hi, Will, great to see you again. You may not know it, but in 2019, I wrote a book titled Society Kills Men. It's about male suicide and all the aspects of feminism. I postulated that feminism makes many men suffer and kills many other men who find that death is a better prospect than life. You yourself were fired from Eton, from what I can see, because of feminism. Do you share my belief and conviction that feminism does literally kill men?"
Interesting question. Thanks, Ken. I'm not sure that feminism is a cause of male death, because one of the things about being a man is that it is just tough anyway, feminism or not. And males are in many ways the testing ground of the species. So what we have is men dying earlier anyway. One of the reasons for that is things like doing the dirtier, more dangerous jobs, in general, being conscripted into war throughout history is probably the clearest example of men having it tougher. Now, does feminism make it worse? Perhaps. One reason for that might be that we've got more women going into the workplace, prioritizing career. And that means that many of the men who might previously have been able to enjoy traditional family setup and all the health benefits that brings with it, because studies in general do show that married men tend to be healthier, live longer, aren't getting that opportunity. And instead, they're just left exposed to the male dominance hierarchy, which I think is the main source of stresses in men's life, the competitiveness of it. And that has very real health consequences. So I'm not sure that it is fair to lay it solely on the door of feminism, but I do think it has exacerbated some of the problems that are already there inherent in being male.
I think I'd just like to add, Will, that I think MRAs are very clear that feminism kills men, and one obvious area is with regards to fathers being denied access to their children. The underlying male to female suicide rate differential in the UK is about 3.5 to 1. It's over 10 in some countries, but it's 3.5 to 1. But it triples again to over 10 to 1 after exposure to the family courts, because men are denied access to their children, and that's very much because of female female pressure on all sorts of areas in the last 40 or 50 years. So feminists are killing men in vast numbers, and not only men, but unborn children. 73 million unborn children killed last year. That's very much down to feminism. So I think the death toll of feminism it eclipses anything else in human history.
The response I'd give to that, if I may, is that if you look at what the ideological roots of feminism are, a lot of the time it's male intellectuals anyway.
True. No, true. I mean, Karl Marx has more blood on his hand than any man in history, as far as I'm concerned. Terry, would you like to ask the next question?
This is from Douglas Wallace. I note that the media is still trying to stack flimsy claims against you, with the latest one that you are involved in a one-man conspiracy against, or for, depending on how you read the headline, Jews. Would you like to make a statement?
I think that they were having a quiet month in the news when I interviewed Dr. E. Michael Jones. Essentially, all that academic did was discuss an article published in Jewish Quarterly and Jewish Chronicle, sorry. And I find it absurd that they can accuse him of being anti-Semitic for bringing up claims discussed openly there. This is just yet another example of some ideas being off limits according to some people, whereas really everything should be subjected to open and rigorous discussion. So that, for me, that spin that Eaton tried there is, I would suggest, just yet another proof that it's about dangerous ideas and wanting to limit free speech.
Steve Moxon, the first of Steve Moxon's question. The author, in case you don't know, Will, the author of the most wonderful book, The Woman Racket, 2008, which I've recommended, must have recommended it 20 times in this conference. Steve Moxon says this: Will, I'd like to hear you elaborate on how and when you see all this nonsense coming to an end, which you say is pretty well inevitable, being a not dissimilar scenario to totalitarianisms of the past.
A good question and a frightening one. And Steve's book was referred to in the Patriarchy Paradox, which was one of the reasons I was such a naughty boy. So I think, when will it end? It could take a very long time. Look at the Soviet Union, for example. Once these things gain momentum, then even once a lot of people disagree, they can carry on in a kind of hollow way for a long time, despite the fact that the vast majority of the population can see through it. Now, I don't think it's going to end anytime soon, especially because people who think that one day they're going to transform from being the type of people who bite their tongues into lions willing to fight back, it's unlikely. The more you bite your tongue, the more easy it is to do it later. So courage is the first thing that's going to be required. Will there become a point where we get to a critical mass of people making it too difficult for these institutions to go further down the woke road? I'd hope so, but ultimately it means people have to pay the sacrifice involved in resisting. And I think that involves having quite a clear-sighted view of there being no happy ever after. I've made that point before, but I truly believe that if people realize there's no happy ever after from being quiet, what have you got to lose? Because it's not a career that expands for decades, being able to do what you want. It's only going to tighten. It's a noose that's tightening. Will it be in the next few decades? I've spoken from some people who've got first-hand experience of the situation as it was in Russia, and they think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. If it accelerates along the current line, the current trajectory of the trans movement and traditional feminism going head to head, I think we might see some interesting fault lines developing, which could bring the whole thing down.
I'm personally of the view, Will, that abortion is going to become the flagship issue for the men's rights movement, and that is something that feminists are. Well, I mean, their position on that, they are the cheerleaders for this 73 million unborn children being killed every year, and I don't think I see that being a battle that they can only lose. Terry, do you want to?
Yeah, another one from Douglas Wallace. Your video argues in favour of patriarchy, with the intent that your students argued against improved feminist views. This leads me to two questions. Firstly, how well did you expect your students to succeed? or were you setting them up to fail? And two, is this a good way to make people think about the concepts being put about by the cultural homogenous?
Well, the aim of the Eton Perspectives debating course isn't actually that they have to prove the opposite case. It's just to assess strengths and weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I knew that there was going to be a bit of backlash to the content of the lecture, because the whole point of it was to address and to counterbalance the prevailing orthodoxy in the college. So I knew it was going to be, as they say, like an oops upside the head to a lot of the boys who'd never heard any of the ideas before, because teachers hadn't presented them to them. But they're all very smart. A lot of them are a lot smarter than I am. And I knew they'd be able to give it a good go. So I think it was a fair challenge for them. Having said that, the press and all the thousands of eyes of woke journalists who poured over the lecture haven't been able to spot a factual mistake. Steven Pinker couldn't either. So I was careful to make sure that it was all legitimate and carefully referenced. We've got over 40 references for a 30-minute talk. And the idea was to send boys to the library ultimately and open their minds. Now, is this a good way of getting people to explore ideas and discuss? Yeah, I think ultimately it's the justification for free speech. People need to be challenged and their views need to be held to account. The pearl is formed by abrasion.
And I will say that the particular format of debate in terms of encouraging boys through their innate competitiveness is exceptionally a good way of getting them to do further reading.
Definitely. What's sad is that I asked external organizations and also Eton staff members to debate alongside me, but nobody took that offer up, which for me is another indication that the culture of debate is not really cherished anymore.
Another one from Steve Moxon, Will. Has the hegemonic extreme feminist outlook across the media seriously damaged your ability to get over your case, or to put over your case, or were there sufficient gaps for you to get across your position? I'm thinking of the ambivalent stance of such as the Daily Mail, which may be generally supportive in terms of the treatment you received, while not being as supportive concerning the issues, if indeed they were even cognizant of them.
Were there sufficient gaps? Yeah, I think there were sufficient gaps. The Times came out with the headline in my favor saying Eton was trampling on the freedom to think. The Telegraph had some supportive pieces too, although I think in general it was, we support his right to free speech, but we don't like what he said in the lecture. There were a few smaller outlets which supported the ideas, but most people were saying, I've come out in support of free speech, but I think the lecture's laughable, without taking the trouble to explain where or why, obviously.
Terry, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll take Douglas Wallace again. I'm being his puppet today, and you're being Steve Moxon's puppet. Douglas asks, your video has been made available. This is a really good question. Your video has been made available in Chinese media. Can you think what China might make of the West's most prestigious school behaving as they have?
I think they find it disappointing and largely amusing. I received some messages of support from some people quite high up in Chinese education saying they were disgusted that Eton, which is supposed to be the bastion of the British education system, was going in this direction, and they feared that other schools might follow. And with its emphasis on banning what are called sissy boys or fresh meat from the pop culture in China, and also emphasizing traditional masculinity, I think one of the reasons it's been made available there is because the messages are just fairly sound, common sense, rooted in evolutionary biology. And most of my clients, interestingly now, for tutoring are Chinese.
That's interesting. And of course, from the a cynical view of Chinese politics, it's a terrific way to rubbish the West. Just this is what Eton banned, and and sacked a teacher for saying. I mean, yep. What greater admonishment of the West culture at the moment than that?
Yeah, you can see it on a few different topics too. Noah Carl, in his trigonometry interview, said that if the West is too afraid to look into the mainstream research published in academic journals on race and IQ and genetics, China will do it.
Yeah.
we're just going to be left further and further behind.
I always stories like on the feminization of the military, particularly in the US, that push to get women on the front line, which always of course requires a lowering of standards, physical standards. I always imagine Chinese and Russian generals laughing their asses off at what the West is doing. I mean, feminism is doing to our military what the Russians and Chinese would struggle to do.
Well, a woke military is a weak military, and the nations exist in the state of nature in relation to each other. And where there's weakness, it invites attack. So I don't think, from the perspective of any power hoping to make a move and attack the West, anything better could be happening. But you've got to remember that this is to a certain extent being done from within the West by people who want it to fall. So obviously that's what you'd want to happen.
I understand there's quite a big increase in the proportion of fighter pilots in the Royal Air Force who are female, and just about all training these days is done in flight simulators. I think if ever we have we have a war against let's say China or Russia, if it's a virtual war, we're going to kick their asses. If they're actually going to get into planes, we're screwed. Terry, is it my as Steve Moxon's puppet? It's probably my turn. Okay. He always tries to throw in one or two words with 5 or 6 syllables just to try and trip me up. That's my theory on it. Anyway, Steve says this: Will, do you fear for the future in terms of the indoctrination of kids, or do you see, with or without a wholesale shift to homeschooling, their inquisitive and contrarian natures instead leading to a resurgence? You owe me one for this, Steve. To a resurgence of revolt by a younger generation, this time against wokery, even to destroy identity politics and its feminist core.
There's a lot of truth in that. I think children do by nature tend to want to rebel. And to the extent that wokery becomes the new orthodoxy, they will rebel against it. And I think it's Hannah Arendt said that a revolution can turn a revolutionary into reactionary overnight. Just depends what you're reacting against. And you can see, I think, a movement amongst the younger generation towards more traditional forms of dating, for example. A few articles on that. And they are more anti-porn than the generation previously.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So I think we're already beginning to see it. Whether it's going to be enough, and crucially, whether they're going to take up positions in the educational and cultural institutions to actually challenge the hegemony, I'm not sure. I hope so.
This is a question from Ken Jolivet. A person's integrity, self-respect, and soul are priceless, but you wouldn't know that from seeing how most people live and respond in this world. Would you put this sad fact down? What would you put this sad fact down to? 80% of people low IQ, weak followers, or what?
I think largely the reason that the woke movement has got as far as it has is down to weakness and a fear that if you don't toe the line, then you're not going to be able to survive. This is one of the things about individualistic capitalism that, oddly enough, meets up with what you get under socialism. Is that sadly most people can't be entrepreneurs, and then you end up working for these big institutions, and their HR departments effectively enforce the kind of political correctness that you get under the most rigid communistic regimes, so that you have to go along with it in order to eat, or at least that's the perception, in order to have a home. But I think the fear is largely unjustified, because beyond the fact that I'm inconvenienced with the housing situation at the moment, I'm earning more than I was at Eton now. And I wouldn't have expected that to be the case. I was worried about it, having 6 kids, but it's there, the possibility is there, and people need to just trust and take the leap.
Yeah, well done for that.
Some comments I thought I'd read out from the chat stream. Steve Moxon says, yes, Will's answers are succinct as well as brilliantly clear. This guy is gold. I thought it was great.
Okay, Douglas Wallace asks, homeschooling is all well and good, but many households which need 2 working adults to pay the mortgage can't manage it. Is there a way to encourage retirees to take on the task of homeschooling?
Oh, interesting question. I'm just going to dispute the premise, if I may, for a second. That idea that you must have 2 working adults to pay the mortgage, it sounds like it's true, but actually it's not. It depends what your priorities are. And there's a sense here in which you have to let the vampire in. That old myth that Dracula's powerless unless that the door's open to him somehow. A lot of this is about taking advantage of people's desire for something, like maybe whether it's a certain kind of house or a certain standard of living, and taking that as the priority and then weaponizing that against what should be the priority, which in this case is the education of children. So there are people who have decided, no, it's more important to have the wife at home the whole time doing the homeschooling and the dad going out to work, and we'll just get whatever house we can afford on that principle. So it can be done. But for most people, yeah, it's going to be a major difficulty. Should retirees take on the task of homeschooling? They used to. It used to be the extended family. It used to be grandparents. But one of the problems about the attack on the nuclear family is that the extended family has gone with it as well. So yes, that atomization, the individualization of the family so that each person is more and more dependent on the state, that's what we're seeing. People need to live closer together so they have more support networks. And then these things become easier. But the more that you relinquish that and give more ground to the state, the more it can use it as leverage against you.
It is interesting. On the issue of grandparents, actually, a strange thing is that there are only 2 mammalians, well, there are only 2 species that have the female menopause, which is the orca whale and humans. And by studying orca whales, they theorize that the reason is because orca whales have a culture. And in order to pass the culture from one generation to another, you actually needed that grandmother who is outside of sexual reproduction to sort of carry it forward. So I think in the human species, it's quite likely that the involvement of grandparents is far more important than we've realized so far.
That wouldn't surprise me. Although I remember having a discussion with Steve Moxon about the grandmother hypothesis in human longevity, and he didn't believe it. He thought that it was more about male competitiveness, trying to survive as long as possible, to impregnate as many people as possible. So if it was used as a point to say that grandmothers somehow crucial in the process of human evolution, I'm not sure I would buy that, but certainly it's the way things used to be done, and it's not done so much anymore. And old people tend to be ushered off towards old people's homes.
Yeah. Will, I don't think I've ever mentioned this publicly before, but I went to a Roman Catholic boys only boarding school from the age of 7 to 16, and look back on them perhaps with rose tinted glasses, I don't know, but as very, very happy days. And I think it's part of what's driven me as an MRA, but that's not for this. To the extent that I have a moral compass, I believe you're a Roman Catholic as well, Will, is that right?
Yeah, yep.
Okay. To the extent that I have a moral compass, it was instilled in me undoubtedly over those years. Our boys' boarding schools, and maybe girls, I don't know, but our boys' boarding schools no longer instilling moral compasses in their boys with, I guess, with the relativism of wokeism. And I personally knew, I think I mentioned this at some point, I personally knew something was very rotten at Eton when the headmaster invited the odious Laura Bates of the Everyday Sexism Project to speak to the boys about masculinity. I realized there is something deeply wrong at Eton here.
Well, one thing is for sure, definitely engaged in the project of trying to recalibrate moral compasses. It's not that they don't install one, it's that they have a very clear and radical idea of what it should be. So boys are constantly getting bopped over the head, being told you mustn't think that, you must think this, here's the right way to view the world. There are a few people more moralizing than the woke. It's just that what they are moralizing about and the way they're doing it in is very different from how it used to be. So in that sense, yes, these traditional boys institutions are losing what was their character, and that's really sad.
Will, what were the things that Eton got right about educating boys? And is the widening male attainment gap in education more linked to demoralizing boys to make the heroic sacrifice for reward, or the structure of classroom teaching?
Okay, good question. Now, I've come to the realization here that I don't think Eton was ever really about the classroom. Yes, there's a free speech principle involved, and a lot of old Etonians are up in arms about it. But I don't think that's ever what the magic of the place was. I think it's mainly about putting boys together in a fairly competitive environment, pretty much 24/7. And it's the social relationships and the friendships they form and the networks this gives them throughout later life. That's what parents get the value for money with. And to the extent that competitiveness is being not just questioned, but attacked on the sports fields and in the classrooms, I think there Eton is losing, and boys' boarding schools and boys' education generally are losing what really makes it work. Now, I've noticed this from teaching in single-sex schools and from mixed schools. Boys thrive on competitiveness. Their games tend to be more competitive, even from before they can talk properly. Boys, when they're tiny toddlers, establish dominance hierarchies. It's inbuilt into what it means to be a man. And if you pull that away, if you pull that organizing structure, the principle of masculinity away from boys, then they feel like, A, there's no real incentive or motivation to improve. They don't get a clear sense of who they are, and their natural drives are being frustrated. I think that the consequence of having so few male teachers in education is that boys don't get this environment cultivated enough. Instead, it's about making them feel good all the time. And ironically, boys don't want to be told they're okay as they are. They want to be challenged and made to do hard things.
Yeah, and have you thought about what's Eton's attitude? Because I can just remember Mugger Ball, where we'd have like one ball and 60 boys on a sports field, and it was chaos, but it was fun.
Yeah, the more traditional full contact sports are either banned or they are on the way to being banned. So boxing went, didn't it? The knives are out for rugby as well. Plenty of people want that to go. So you can see why so many boys lose interest in school.
Question from Carl Palmer. Will, thanks for the presentation and for your clear and concise answers. I've never heard someone link attacking patriarchy to attacking God the Father and seeking to destroy both the natural and holy family. Do you also see the links between those trying to discredit you with those trying to discredit God, and that you're in good company with the prophets who also got into trouble when the truth they spoke got too close for comfort?
Nice question.
Well, the link between the attack on the nuclear family and the Holy Family and the structure of authority in Christianity is plain to see in Marx's writings. People don't talk about it much because I think it is one of those cases where it's hidden in plain sight. To an extent, anybody speaking the truth and making that their top priority is going to suffer for it. That's what history shows. But equally, as I've said, I don't think ultimately you escape suffering by lying. I think lying is always going to lead to a dance with the devil in the end in some form or another. Some people are happy to take the ticket. Sometimes whole cultures try it, but eventually it doesn't work out. Is this another question about courage? I think ultimately it might be. So one of the roles of being a man is about protecting, as I made clear in the video, and the assaults on family culture need to be protected against as well. And men are going to bear the brunt of those blows.
Just something off the cuff, Will. The The next speaker we have up is a gay man. He has drawn parallels between the persecution of gays at around the turn of the century, the early part of the century, and the persecution of toxic masculinity now, in that it's very much aligned with the same domains. And I was wondering if you might have any observations on that yourself.
I can think of a few. What is his proposed mechanism? What's the main similarity as he sees it?
I think he talks. I think going back further to 60s and 70s, I think that gay men, society regarded gay men as sort of threats to children, as that there were just a whole bunch of negatives to do with gay men. And he points out now that's moved. The window's moved, so it's now all men.
But in particular, on the issue of rough and tumble play, the domain was attacking rough and tumble play.
Yeah.
But when they were attacking gays, they said, rough and tumble play will cure homosexuality. It's a lack of rough and tumble play that's creating homosexuality. and now it's that same domain, and they're saying that the rough and tumble play is causing toxic masculinity. But what they're saying is that the results of this, which was a danger to women, a danger to children, all this kind of business, is exactly the same, but from a completely inverted view. Yeah,
that doesn't surprise me that's the line of argument. The book After the Ball, which I've done a video on YouTube, which hopefully is still up, called How Woke Works, says that it's the same playbook underlying all these different approaches of trying to discredit or shame or ostracize people. So the underlying principles involved are trying to associate the characteristic that you want people to be ashamed of with other behaviors, which most people take as shameful for granted, is how it works. It's emotional rather than rational. So that's why the story about interviewing E. Michael Jones came out, for example. It's just another attempt at a slur. So once you accept that you're going to be slurred, but that's not an argument and you don't care about it, then they have very little power against you. That's what more people need to realize.
Yeah. Very good.
Just quickly, Mike Bell says, we need you, Will, in the men's issues movement. I like that. Philip Tanzer writes this: how can we best connect critical race theory, which is now being identified by the government as harmful, with feminist ideology? Making this connection could help address feminist ideology as a danger in education. And any thoughts on that?
Well, it is essentially about viewing the entirety of society and human history through a lens of group conflict, specifically the oppressor and the oppressed model. And I don't think Marx actually really believed anything he wrote in the sense of caring about whether it was true or not. All he saw it was as different ways to agitate, different ways to in the society and poke at it until enough people get annoyed. Now, first of all, in classical economic Marxist theory, it was looking at the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and trying to focus on class conflict. Didn't work. In fact, the opposite of all his predictions happened, but didn't seem to affect him much in terms of confidence. And then we've got instead the attempt to use the same model, but between men and women. So men are the oppressor class, women are the oppressed. And critical race theory in America is just poking at America's sore spot, which happens to be race relations because of the history of slavery. It's exactly the same model. And if you could only get rid of all the white oppressors, then there'd be this harmonious, conflict-free society where the blacks would finally be no longer oppressed. And
so like in Africa, I guess, where there's no conflict.
Right, of course, yeah. And these utopias are always just around the corner, even though no one's ever found them. Yeah. So the problem is that the assumption is that it's one group causing the problems for another group. So we get this extreme sense of in-group identity and then hostility towards out-groups. But the most worrying thing about it is that evil is out there. And if it is removed, if the bad guys are done away with, then things will be okay. Whereas, of course, really, the evil is within all of us. The conflict's within the heart. It's very easy to externalize it and very dangerous to.
Yeah. Douglas Wallace asks, You have other videos such as the Matriarchy Mystery, Why Patriarchy Empowers Women. Do you intend to create more videos inviting questions on gender, sex and culture?
Yes, although I'm not sure YouTube's going to be the forum for it. They've already banned a couple of videos. So I'm moving things over to Substack and some other free speech platforms. I think to be successful on YouTube, you just have to be a transvestite nowadays. Yes, more videos on that topic for sure.
That's why Joe Rogan left. Steve Moxon asks, do you think boys necessarily need male teachers to provide role models, or can male culture be inculcated as well, or almost as well, by non-woke women teachers who understand children and sex difference?
Yeah, definitely. I think just as you had in, excuse me, just as you had in traditional tribal societies, it was the women who told the men to man up, the women who often encouraged the men to go to war and did the dances, etc., to make them pumped up. You can get the same effect on a smaller level with a woman in a classroom who is extolling to boys that they need to be living up to this masculine ideal. Some boys respond better to that from a woman than they do from a man, because ultimately what boys and men do is most of the time in life to impress women. So if you've got a teacher, female teacher to impress, that works just as well. I don't think it models the image of masculinity as well, but women are just as capable of explaining it. And certainly many of the female teachers at Eton who supported me have got far bigger balls than the headmaster.
I assume, Will, that the majority of teachers at Eton are men.
Yeah, although they're working very, very hard to fix that.
I'll bet they are. We had something, or I had something in my in my speech last year about from a guy called, I can't remember his name, but he's got a real walrus moustache, and he runs the History Debunked YouTube channel. Absolutely wonderful. So he has things on there about how the suffragettes delayed emancipation, female emancipation, which Steve Moxon talks about as well. Also that Florence Nightingale was personally responsible for huge numbers of British military dying. But so this guy had something on the dumbing down of education since 1987-88, when O levels were replaced by GCSEs. And it was absolutely jaw-dropping, the extent of the dumbing down in mathematics, but I mean that coincides with the feminization of the teaching profession. So whereas one man, typically, when I was a boy, most of my teachers were men. I think most teachers generally were men, not just but so over time that man became replaced by a female teacher and a female teaching assistant. And they are making a complete hash of education. The decline in, Eton, and I guess similar schools may be different, but the dumbing down of the education system in the UK almost makes me weep.
Yep, I agree. Not a lot more to add to that. I wrote an essay on that as part of my teacher training, and they almost didn't let me finish the course.
Ken Jolivet asks, as Jordan Peterson says, if you think tough men are dangerous, wait till you see what weak men can cause. This speaks to manhood. What would you define as a man?
Oh, this is easy. From the viewpoint of traditional Roman Catholic natural law theory, the essence of manhood is the potential for fatherhood. And same for womanhood. The essence of womanhood is the potential for motherhood. So that broadly is a philosophical way of talking about the fact that there are two gametes, and you can dance around that all you like. But if you move away from that basic first principle, you open up big mistakes further down the line. That ironically is what feminism has done, because by trying to move away from the fact that the potential for motherhood is the essence of womanhood, they've said, okay, so maybe being a woman is about having really nice makeup or having a career. And then the trans women say, well, we're women too then. Because we've got that. Yeah. So that's the problem. So manhood, potential for fatherhood, and that's why the masculine virtues traditionally are all about you've got protecting, you've got cultivating, you've got nurturing. It's all directed for the benefit of children, and that's why the two sexes exist.
At about 30 minutes into the patriarchy paradox, You find a link between feminist androgenization, incest, and pedophilia in the writings of feminist Andrea Dawkins. This is sensational stuff and arguably reflected in real actions by members of the political left, most recently Chris Cuomo's producer at CNN. But the critiques of your work didn't seem to focus on this issue much at all. Why not?
I knew they wouldn't when I made it, because the Guardian were the ones who pointed out that Andrea Dawkins, who's the one that advocates these androgynous communities where not only are gender, male, female social constructs, but the difference between men and children are also social constructs, men, women, and children. So the Guardian was the one saying that she is the feminist whose vision we need for the future. So it's quite embarrassing for them to put out there in the press that they're basically saying someone who advocates pedophilia as a logical consequences of her views is the vision for the future. I think it was essentially too hot a topic for them to touch, and it goes deep into postmodernism. There was that piece that came out in the Times recently about Michel Foucault, probably the most famous postmodernist, raping little boys in Tunisia. Yeah. And many of the French intellectuals signed a petition calling for the abolition of the age of consent. This is a thread that runs right the way through that gender identity movement. Arguably, I think it's mainly about destabilizing the family as well, because if you sexualize children and then weaken the respect for the authority of parents, then a lot of what discipline and behavior and culture in the family has been is gone. And this promotion of sexual deviancy is also about population reduction, because the two things.
Will, something that MRAs have long been very frustrated about, and with good cause, is the pro-feminist and anti-male bias of the mainstream media. We're starting to get some indications that that entrepreneurs are going to be starting male-friendly media soon, and I hope some of these guys become billionaires, because I think it's an idea whose time has come. Somebody's going to monetize this. And I don't know if that's what prompted Philip Tanzer to come up with the interesting question. Will, how about you ask GB News to host a section on men's issues on their channel? Will's Man Cave, maybe a weekly segment.
Let me just say, I don't like the phrase man cave, because men shouldn't be in caves. They should be out in the public square. That's the way it's been done traditionally. And the problem is the idea that you give them a cave and they can go and play with their toys in the cave. That's not how it should be. I don't know whether GB News would be amenable to do that. I don't know whether they really let me say what I want to say, but something like that needs to happen. Needs to be more of it.
Land Ray asks, there is a growing debate about whether or not it is better to preserve and fight to redeem corrupted institutions, or simply to begin to rebuild new ones. And that kind of relates to the last question as well. Are institutions such as Eton College salvageable? How do we begin to replace what has been lost from these institutions?
I believe these institutions are lost. I think this has been a long time coming, and people had the chance earlier to turn it back. You would have to clear out the leadership, because people have been put at the top so that it all rots from the head down. I've made that point before. This happened in ancient Rome as well. Civilizations, institutions rot from the head down, same as fish. And they have then appointed people in strategic positions, and it's all filtering down to ground level. Then you get the kind of parents they want sending the kids there, because the whole character of the place has changed. So it probably could be undone in a long, long time. So it ultimately is going to come down to family. People who are leaving their kids in those places need to do very, very hard work, probably daily, to resist what's happening at school. But most of it is going to be about starting new institutions elsewhere, at least for the time being, a kind of catacomb culture.
Yeah, Will, I agree.
Yeah, Will, I agree 100%. And it's the reason that my political party is no longer going to, for 8.5 years, we've tried to engage with politicians, influence them and so on. And I've decided, I've come to the end of that road. And when we relaunch as a pro-family, pro-children and pro-life party in February or March, we shall basically be adopting the strategy that led to Brexit, Nigel Farage's, because such a proportion of the population really, at the moment they only have the only choices they have is parties who are happy with unborn children being killed and all the rest of it. I think it is rotten to the core. It can't be negotiated with, and it needs to be toppled, I think. And I know Nigel Farage will, and I get that, but I think the strategy is the only one that's viable, quite frankly.
Will, do you think that there's sufficient, because you've obviously been within wealthier circles, and do you think that there is the will to put resources into establishing parallel institutions?
Oh, good question. Talking is easy, isn't it? When it actually comes down to the money, who wants to do it? I would say it's encouraging that I've already cost Eton such an enormous amount of money, millions and millions, because of the OEs who've withheld funds. And one of the upsides of my case not being heard till 2023 is that things are only going to get worse there in the meantime. More and more donors will get angry. But the basic principle is that money talks. And until we get people setting up new institutions backed by some of these big companies who aren't afraid to be seen to be anti-woke, then we're going to get what we deserve, which is any voices who want to offer some kind of challenge being starved out financially. But I don't think that even matters too much, in the sense that, which is why all these attacks are fundamentally against the family in the first place. Antonio Gramsci's idea is very clear that that's how it works, and it does work incredibly well. But the reason for hope is that the opposite works too.
Yes.
It's an interesting point, because I mean, rich men will have been notably absent as donors to individuals and organizations in the men's rights movements. People are forever saying, every time some, let's say, Russian oligarch gets divorced in London, and his wife walks away with £2 billion or something, they'll say, "Why don't you write to that guy?" And see, and I know people who've done that year in, year out for 30 years and never had so much as a response to the letter. Yeah.
I wonder whether some of these guys get rich by playing the system and being compliant. They look like they must be really aggressively kind of alpha male dominant. They don't take any prisoners, but maybe it's just about being politically sophisticated and getting along with people. Then you get promoted.
Indeed. In fact, there was a guy, I think it was the Earl of Northampton, who started off with, I think it was about £80 million fortune, divorced once, so that became 40 million. Divorced a second time, became 20. Divorced again, became 10. And you think at some point he'd wake up and smell the coffee, but no. As soon as that divorce went through, he announced he was engaged again. Turkeys do vote for Christmas. What can I say?
Just on that earlier point, Will. Oh Christ! Sorry, I'm sorry.
Shall I ask the next question?
Steve Moxon.
From Steve Moxon. Will, can you list? I think you did mention them, but it was very quickly. You're in the internet platforms you use. Do you think new actual free speech platforms will survive and even replace such as YouTube?
The approach that YouTube is taking at the moment, which is just an extreme safe space where if someone gets upset, the content is harassment, same as Eton, will eventually lead it to become some kind of woke echo chamber wasteland. So serious discussions will move off it, apart from maybe ones like BitChute and Odyssey and torrenting, where there's no central host for the content. I think will be very hard for them to police. So there's some promise there. And then we've also got a few which have come out as explicitly anti-censorship, like Substack, where you can get audios of my videos and some articles as well. They've left up the stuff of mine that YouTube has taken down for hurting feelings. One of which, amazingly, was just reading out some chapters from a biology textbook.
Excellent. And I know Gab, I think, a platform owned by an evangelical Christian, I always forget his name, claims to be the only serious free speech platform left in the world today, and is getting plenty of support, and especially from Christians, I think, but also others.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, Substack seems good, but I've heard good things about Gab too, and Gab has come under attack a couple of times in the last few weeks, which means it's probably doing something well.
I wonder, Terry, sorry, I wonder if I could just ask the one from the question from anonymous attendee, because our number one financial supporter is very much. It could almost this could almost come from him. In fact, I don't know. It may even be that he's logged in as an anonymous attendee. He says, "Oh no, I'm terribly sorry. No, this is from Hannah Gal, who the creator of the wonderful documentary we played on the first day, Will, titled "Progressivism is Destroying Men, Families, Society, and Civilization." And I think she's quite right. She says, what would you say to parents who disagree with school's woke narrative, but worry that their objections will reflect badly on the child? And so I guess she means that the child will suffer. And so certainly our number one donor is in exactly that position, and he's just fuming about it.
Well, look, your child is suffering right now from you staying silent. So what do you care more about? The opinion that the people running the school have of your child, and you obviously don't really respect what they have to say anyway, because they're ruining the institution. What your child is undergoing there day by day, this is a subtle form of the smearing and the slurring tactic. So if you dare to object, then you must be, presumably they'll say racist or sexist or homophobic or misogynistic or anti-Semitic, whatever it is, whatever buzzword they think is going to shut you up. But meanwhile, because you're too afraid to cope with that, it's brief, it's transient, it either sticks or it doesn't. Nothing stuck to me so far. And I don't see how it could, bearing in mind it's just mean names. Ignore it and make the point that you need to make, which is that the institution is going downhill. What are you going to get?
I've got to say, when men do stand up, I've known many of them, and they say that they definitely walk taller. Because I mean, to kowtow to this bullshit, I mean, it's not good for the soul. I don't think.
My wife got pregnant with the 6th child around the time I got sacked. I don't know how it happened.
But I think you do know.
Just quickly,
sorry,
we're really short on time, so I just want to get Mike Bell's question in.
Yes.
Society without ever making positive decisions. To what extent do you think that anti-male activists are unaware followers of fashion, or are people who have made a positive ideological decision?
Okay, this is a good question. The answer ultimately is that this particular ideology weaponizes the natural tendency of men to be chivalrous towards women. That's the real heartless thing involved in it. It's why it's so effective, because who wants to be seen as a man to be poo-pooing ideas that are supposed to? But what you have to realize is that this ideology is anti-women. Most women aren't feminists. You can't repeat that enough. Most women aren't feminists. And most women who do live consistently according to the principles and advice of feminism, even Simone de Beauvoir herself recommend that they should have made different choices. So looking back on her life, she talked about how she wished that her thought had given birth to something, but it hadn't. Regret that the family wasn't there. So that you're essentially saving them from becoming cat women.
Yes.
Carl Palmer says, Will, why not go to GB News and suggest a weekly slot called Will Let Loose in the Public Square?
Yeah, I've been on GB News before. I got interviewed by Andrew Doyle. They saw me. If they liked me, they would have said something. They don't like me, I promise you.
Well, we like you, Will.
Good.
I think that's been pretty much a unanimous.
Steve Moxon, who has a brain the size of a planet, writes this: Will Knowland's is the sharpest mind I've come across in a long time. Well, that's a great compliment coming from Steve.
It's just because I read Steve's book.
Yeah, he says
mutual black sapling.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I think yes, I think I'll wrap it up there. Will, I knew it was going to be a fascinating session, and we get lots of wonderful questions and great answers. I don't think, Terry, that we've asked so many questions and had such great answers. in any of the Q&As before this. So Will, thank you so much indeed. Huge fan. I mean, all MRAs I know are just huge fans of your work, and we wish you great success in future. Steve Moxon says yes, zero waffle.
Yeah, that's
I
true.
think yes. I think that's quite right. Eton College has lost an extraordinary man. Terry, thank you so much for talking of extraordinary men. Terry, thank you for joining me again as co-host. I shall have to wrap it up there, and we have a very interesting guy called Richard Addison in an hour's time. His video follows in 2 minutes, but I'm really looking forward to that Q&A. And it's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from them.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.